Hi, and welcome to another episode of Hot Takes with me, the Silver Fox. And this is a very weird video. It's not one I'm going to get angry about. It's not one that annoys me. It's not one of my usual rants or anything like that. It's just one I found highly, highly amusing. Because it goes to show how all these wokies have got something so spectacularly wrong. And how government policy has been shaped and formed because they are effectively idiots. We'll have to look at the trans community in this country and we say, what group do you think would have the highest the highest percentage of trans in that group? Well, the answer would surprise you, I think. According to official government statistics from the ONS, the Office of National Statistics, the group with the highest percentage of trans identifying people are Muslims. And there are more trans people living in Brent than in Brighton. Doesn't that surprise you? I don't know if you've ever been to Brent, but I can't ever think I've seen any in Brent. I've certainly seen them in Brighton. And who would have thought that Muslims were the most likely to be trans? It's very weird, isn't it? In fact, it's so weird, it's statistically unlikely. And in fact, they're now launching a probe because they realise that actually it isn't true at all. Well, it's true insofar as they are what the official government statistics show. But it's just obvious that the official government statistics are a load of old rubbish. And so we're going to take a look at this article and to show that there aren't 250,000 people in this country who identify as trans. That figure is a load of rubbish, and the real figure is much, much lower. And given how small it is likely to be, it may force some people to realise that the trans issue is a bit of a loser. And if you think you're going to attract all these trans people who don't exist to your cause or your product, then you're going to be deeply disappointed. Here goes. So the watchdog launches probe amid concerns that ONS figures on the transgender population have been substantially overestimated by a massive amount. ONS figures said there's 262,000 transgender people in England and Wales. That's according to their statistics, based on what is now obviously very, very flawed data. The statistics regulator yesterday launched a formal probe into fears that the transgender population has been substantially overestimated. The Office for Statistical Regulation, the OSR, said it was reviewing findings from the ONS suggesting that there's 262,000 transgender people in England and Wales. If there's even a tenth of that, I would be very surprised. In a letter to Jen Wolford, the ONS Director of Population Statistics, OSR boss Ed Humferson said it was launching the review after concerns being raised with us regarding the correlation of gender identity with other characteristics. And it will consider whether the ONS breached the code of practice for statistics, and hopefully it has, and hopefully somebody will be forced to resign and this whole debacle can be shown up for what it is, a pile of dingo's kidneys. It is absolute rubbish. Academics believe the 262,000 figure is wrong because the question used to record gender identity in 2021 census may have confused respondents whose main language was not English. Now, before we get to this question, they could have asked a very simple question. But they chose not to answer a simple question because they realised that this simple question may cause offence. And so they used weasel words in a way that would ultimately confuse people, but did so that they didn't accidentally annoy or harm someone with the use of words, because we are wankers. Honestly. They say that this is likely explains why the ONS found that 1 in 67 Muslims is transgender. Now, if 1 in 67 Muslims in this country is transgender from their statistics, and then they apply that out, based on that number out, across the population, you are going to get a massive, massive, shift towards the number of transgender people. But 1 in 67 Muslims is obviously not transgender. That level of transgenderism would be the highest in the world by a massive margin. Not just a bit, but by 2 orders of magnitude. It must clearly be wrong. Any scientist, anyone with maths training would look at this as a massive outlier and say there's something desperately wrong with those numbers. But they didn't do that, perhaps because they want to push an agenda. Who knows? It also found why the London boroughs of Newham and Brent, where many speak English as a second language, recorded the highest proportion of trans people. And as I say, if you've ever been to Newham or Brent, you'll be hard pushed to find a trans person. MPs and campaigners believe that the apparent overestimation may have led to an exaggerated focus on transgender issues. Yeah, all of a sudden they're thinking, 0.5% of the population are trans. It's not even going to be 1% of that 0.5%. Professor Carl Hennigan, director of Oxford University's Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine, said, "I think the information in this category is invalid, so it's welcome that they're going to review it. I think this review will say that actually there was a substantial problem with the question when it came to people whose main language was not English." He went on, "I think the problem here is that they clearly haven't road tested the question well enough with people whose first language was not English. They need to set out a strategy so we don't see this problem again. The error is so great that I think it will be deemed invalid." The error is, like I say, 2 orders of magnitude outside of what would be expected. And in science, anything like that, anything that is such a massive outlier, obviously is wrong, obviously has to be retested, has to be looked at, has to be discovered why it is so wrong. And when you see why, when you see the question in a minute, you'll understand why it's so wrong. He added, "It is an important lesson for the ONS to learn because this information is essential on how we plan future policies and services," which is why everyone was pushing this woke bollocks, because they thought, there's a 250,000 woke, there's a 250,000 trans in the country. I bet there's not 2,500, for God's sake. He said, "We need an overhaul of the ONS processes, such as getting data peer reviewed." And that was needed. He said, and Professor Alice Sullivan, head of research at UCL Social Research Institute, said, "I strongly welcome this intervention from the Office of Statistical Regulation." The Code of Practice for Official Statistics states that quality means that statistics fit their intended uses and are based on appropriate data and methods and are not materially misleading, which these obviously are. The anomalies of the 2021 census data call into question whether the data produced on gender identity meet this standard, and the ONS published figures in January showing that 262,000 people, or 0.5% of the population over 16, declared themselves as transgender. It is nowhere near that. Not even close. It was based on answers to the 2021 census, which explored gender identity for the first time. Of the 262,000, 118,000 did not provide further details, while 48,000, or 0.1% of the population aged 16 or over, identified as a trans man. A further 48,000 identified as a trans woman, around 30,000 as non-binary, and 18,000 wrote a different identity. Why so many? We'll have to look at the question, but it's good. Those who speak English poorly were 5 times more likely to be trans. That should be the key signifier. So 400% more likely. 400% more likely to be trans if you could not speak English. It's obviously not right. Adults whose first language was not English accounted for 10% of the population, but made up nearly 30% of the trans total. Academics believe the apparently flawed figures likely stemmed from the question asked. Rather than keeping it simple with a question such as, "Are you transgender?" Respondents were asked, is the gender you identify with the same as your sex registered at birth? Now imagine someone either who is not native speaker, not a native of Britain, not a native speaker, or someone who lives here but who has poor skills, or is stupid, is below, a bit educationally subnormal. That question becomes incredibly confusing. So not only can you just disregard everyone who doesn't speak English as a first language, or those people who have a poor grasp of English, and take off all the stupid people, what you're left with? A tiny, tiny amount of that 262,000. It's ridiculous. Tory MP Sir John Hayes said, statistically, this appears to be an open and shut case that reveals a glitch. He says, the problem is, when you look at the whole trans debate, you might assume the trans community is enormous. But in fact, it's a tiny number of people. Fellow Conservative Paul Bristow, which is what we've been saying all along. If there's as many trans out there as people think, they'd be everywhere. You wouldn't be able to walk through the streets without falling over them. But they're not there because they're not there. Fellow Conservative Paul Bristow said, it certainly raises a few eyebrows, having a larger trans community in Brent or Newham than places like Brighton. And that's why we need to ensure every care is taken to ensure these surveys are as thoughtful as possible to communities that might not have English as a first language. And so there we are. There we have it. All this crap over the last few years, pushing this bad agenda about trans identification and pushing weirdos into schools, pushing dangerous predators into public spaces, into women's spaces, because they think there's a lot of them there and there might be a vote or two, and it turns out that there isn't. And of course you've also got to remember that a lot of these trans are only trans in the hope that they don't have to do hard time in prison, and some of them identify as trans because they are predictably predators. They want to identify as trans so they can get into women's spaces to, fulfill their fantasies. That is undoubtedly the case. Government figures show themselves. Now, I know you shouldn't, because, we're saying the ONS is wrong because of a survey, but actual other government figures which actually are not based on statistical likelihoods, but are based on actual data, actual true data. 60% of trans in prisons are in prisons for sex crimes. Only 6% are in the Gen Pop, which means trans prisoners 10 times more likely to be sex offenders. And that just tells you the problem you have with this push for trans in the bigger community, because the government think trans are a bigger number than they are. And it turns out that they're not. And in fact, trans are 10 times more likely to be sex offenders. So that's the problem you have. And that is why we have been subjected for several years now to all this woke wankery over trans issues. And now we can be seen for what it is, a tiny, tiny number of mentally ill people who need support and help. Very few of them are actually trans. If they are genuinely actually trans, then give them the help and help them transform and give them the operations. And the operations themselves are terrible. But for most of these people, they're not trans, they just don't exist. For a lot of them that pretend to be trans, they're doing the woman face thing for reasons. And then you have the few that are just confused and have never actually sought professional help. But the numbers are tiny. Absolutely tiny. And this now shows it. And it's what we've been saying all along. Anyway, I'll round up and come up. Well, I don't want to say I told you so. But hey, we've been saying for ages there is no way the number of trans in this country are anything approaching what the government is saying. And this is why they've been pushing all these things. We've got to give men the right to go into women's spaces. We've got to give men the right to go into women's toilets. We've got to give men the right to access women's changing rooms, because votes and push this and there's so many, it's significant. And it's not significant. They are statistically negligible. They are so small. Now, you could go to Brighton and you'll see them in Brighton. And sure, I go to Brighton, up and down to Brighton. Me and my wife, we go to Brighton. We last time we were there, we were sitting there, we walked into a bar, we had a couple of drinks, first thing, first opening, we were the first two in, had a couple of drinks, some other people come in, small people come in, we were there a couple of hours, and suddenly realised that my wife was the only lady in the bar. And you know what, we didn't get up and leave, it was a gay bar, so what? So who cares, right? They sell good beer. So we sat there, had a couple of drinks and chatting away with people. And I sort of said jokingly, sorry, it must seem a bit odd having some straight people in a gay bar. And they said, no, it happens all the time, they don't care. And it's fine. I don't care that it was a gay bar. They don't care that a couple of straight people were in there. Nobody cares. That's the great thing about Brighton. Nobody cares. And so that's why you get so much, let's call it alternative lifestyle, rather than anything sort of the norm, if you like. Not saying that being gay, lesbian or anything is not normal. I'm not saying that. But what I mean is you get the more outre go to Brighton as well because of its tolerance. But, you walk through the streets of Brent, the streets of Blackburn, the streets of Luton, wherever, up and down the country. You don't have 0.5% of the population. It's not 1 in every 200 people you meet wandering around is trans. It just clearly isn't. It's just not. And you can see that with your own eyes. And we've been saying it for so long. If trans were as many as the government have been pushing, you couldn't hurl a brick without clipping someone, a bloke in heels. It just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. They're not there. And now we know why. It's because the people who did it had to use weasel words because they daren't just come out and say, "Are you trans?" Because they want to do hurty fee-fees. And so they do all this other weaselly word crap. And now it ends up that, hey, Brent, the most trans-friendly area of Britain. Let me tell you, you'd be a very brave trans if you wandered round the middle of Brent late at night. That's all I'm going to say on that. But anyway, there we are. I just thought it was amusing and shows exactly why we have all been subjected to this push for trans rights and everything over the years. It's because the government are morons. But you don't expect anything else, do you? Anyway, there we go. Thank you very much for watching. If you like what you hear and see on the channel, please hit that button there. And or not. It's a binary choice. But please do. And also, the big one, do hit a like. They're always great. Thank you very much. If you have anything to say on this subject, do read. I'm going to be very interested in what people say on this. So do please comment. Anyway, until next time, stay safe, stay well away from Brighton, and goodbye.